They said no woman would ever wed the scarred blacksmith of Cedar Hollow. And for 11 long years, the town had been right. Eli Brennan was 38 years old, and half his face belonged to a fire that had taken everything else from him, too. The left side was smooth and weathered, the face of a man who had once been called handsome by the girls at the church socials. The right side told a different story. A map of old burns that ran from his jaw up past his ear. Pale and ridged where the flames had climbed before the neighbors pulled him from the burning barn. He had stopped looking in mirrors a decade ago. He had stopped mostly looking at anyone at all. He worked. That was the one thing the fire had not taken. His hands still knew iron the way some men knew scripture. And the ring of his hammer carried down the main street of Cedar Hollow from the first gray light of dawn until the lamps came on in the windows. Horseshoes, plow blades, hinges, axe heads, the iron rims of wagon wheels. There was not a homestead in the valley that did not depend on something Eli Brennan had shaped over his anvil. They needed him. They simply did not want to look at him while they paid. What they did not know on that cold morning in the autumn of 1889 was that a letter was already riding towards Cedar Hollow in the leather satchel of the eastbound stage. And that letter was about to undo 11 years of being right. Margaret Sullivan was 34 years old and she had buried more of her life than most women twice her age. She had grown up in a narrow brick row house in Boston, the daughter of a seamstress and a dock worker, and she had married young, the way poor girls did when a steady man came asking. Her husband had been kind and quiet and consumptive, and the coughing had taken him 3 winters back, peaceful at the end, gone in his sleep with her hand in his. There had been no children. There had been after the funeral only the boarding house where she cooked and scrubbed for $11 a month, and the slow, grinding certainty that this was all the rest of her years would hold. It was the boarding house cook, a wide and practical woman named Hetty, who had slid the newspaper across the kitchen table one evening and tapped a column with a flour-dusted finger. "Matrimonial notices," Hetty had said, "don't make that face. My own sister went west on one of these. Got herself a cattleman in Wyoming and 4 sons and her own front parlor. You think Boston's got something better waiting on you?" Margaret had read the notices by candlelight that night, and most of them she had set aside. Men who wanted servants, men who wanted breeding stock, men whose words crawled with a need she did not trust. But one had stopped her because it was honest in a way the others were not. Blacksmith, Cedar Hollow, Montana Territory. 38 years of age. Steady trade. Own land, own home. Am not a handsome man and will not pretend otherwise. Was burned in a fire some years past and bear the marks of it plainly. Seek a wife who values a quiet life and an honest one. Can offer respect, a roof, and faithful company. Cannot offer more than that, but will not offer less. She had read it 4 times, and what struck her was not the warning about his face, but the thing underneath it. A man who had decided to tell the truth first before anyone could use it against him. She knew something about being marked by a life you had not chosen. She had written him that same week, and she had told her own truths in return. The thing she did not yet know, as the stage carried her at last over the final ridge and down into the valley, was how badly that small Montana town wanted her to be a fool. The stagecoach rolled into Cedar Hollow on a Thursday afternoon, and word that the blacksmith's bride had come traveled faster than the dust settled. By the time Margaret stepped down onto the boardwalk in her good gray traveling dress, a quiet crowd had already gathered the way crowds do when they expect to witness something. A gawking, a humiliation, a story to carry home. The mercantile owner stood in his doorway. 2 women paused with their market baskets. A knot of men outside the saloon turned to watch, and one of them said something low that made the others laugh. Margaret heard it. She had spent enough years being looked at by people who thought less of her to know exactly what that laughter meant. She was tired to the bone, dust in every seam of her clothes, her trunk being lowered to the boards behind her. And then the crowd shifted, and a path opened, and she saw him. Eli Brennan had come straight from the forge. He still wore his leather apron, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow over forearms corded with a lifetime of iron. He had washed his hands and his face, she could see, in honor of her arrival, and the washing had only made the scars plainer in the afternoon light. He stood at the edge of the crowd, holding his hat in both hands, and he was braced. She would understand this only later, for her to look at him, and change her mind in front of the whole town. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the Boston woman would do. Margaret crossed the boardwalk to him. She looked at the burned side of his face openly, without flinching, and without the careful sliding away of the eyes that he had learned to expect from every stranger. Then she put out her gloved hand. "Mr. Brennan," she said, loud enough to carry. "I'm Margaret. You wrote a very honest letter. I've come a long way on the strength of it." For a moment he could not speak. The crowd, which had come for a different ending, began quietly to lose interest and drift apart. "Ma'am," he managed at last. His voice was rougher than she'd imagined. "There's a wagon for your trunk. The house is just up the rise." "Then let's go home," Margaret said. "And you can tell me what a blacksmith eats for supper, because I aim to cook it better." And the thing neither of them could have guessed, riding up that rise in the failing light, was that the hardest part was not the town at all. The hardest part would be learning to believe they were allowed to keep this. The house was small and plain and clean, and that surprised her. She had braced herself for a bachelor's squalor, 4 years of grease and neglect, and dishes gone gray in a basin. Instead, she found a tidy 2 rooms, a swept floor, a bed he had clearly given up to her, while he made plain his intention to sleep in the lean-to off the forge until she said otherwise. There was a jar of late airs on the table. He had cut wild flowers for her, this enormous scarred man, and then plainly not known what to do with them, and the sight of those drooping airs in a canning jar undid something in Margaret's chest that the long journey had not. "It isn't much," he said from the doorway, turning his hat again in his hands. "It's more than I've had in a long while," she said, and meant it. They were married on Sunday by the circuit preacher in the small white church at the end of the street with 2 witnesses and no celebration. Margaret wore her gray dress and a sprig of the airs pinned at her collar. When the preacher asked Eli to speak his vows, his voice shook on the words, and Margaret reached over and took his hand and held it through to the end. And the men who had laughed outside the saloon on Thursday were not laughing now. The first weeks were careful. They moved around each other like 2 people afraid of breaking something. He rose before dawn and worked till dark. And she made the small house into a home. Curtains at the windows, bread rising on the hearth, his torn shirts mended in the evenings while he sat across the room pretending to read the almanac and stealing looks at her when he thought she did not notice. She noticed. She let him think she didn't. What changed everything was a child. The child was Sadie Mercer, age 7, and she belonged to the widow who ran the boarding house at the far end of town. Sudie had decided, with the unshakable logic of a 7-year-old, that the blacksmith's forge was the most wonderful place in all of Cedar Hollow. She liked the orange glow and the hiss of the quench, and the way sparks flew up like a swarm of fireflies. Her mother had warned her off it. The other children had told her the blacksmith was a monster, that his face had been burned because the devil had marked him. Sudie had considered this information and rejected it entirely because monsters did not, in her experience, make tiny iron horses for no reason at all. That was how it had started, weeks before Margaret ever arrived. Eli had caught the child watching from the fence one afternoon, and instead of chasing her off, he had cooled a scrap of iron and bent it with 3 quick strokes into the shape of a little galloping horse and set it on the rail and gone back to his work without a word. Sudie had taken it home and slept with it under her pillow. She had been coming back ever since. Margaret found the 2 of them one golden afternoon. The scarred blacksmith crouched down to a child's height, patiently showing her how the bellows breathed life into the coals, and the little girl gazing up at his ruined face with absolutely no fear in her at all, only delight. And Margaret understood in that moment something the whole town had gotten wrong for 11 years. They had decided the marks on Eli Brennan's face were the truest thing about him. The child knew better. The child had never once been confused about which part of him to believe. "She's not scared of me," Eli said quietly that night, as if it still astonished him. "Everybody's scared of me. She just isn't." "Children see what's actually there," Margaret said. "It's the rest of us who have to learn it back." And in the saying of it, she heard the truth of her own heart spoken aloud before she had quite meant to speak it. Winter came down hard on Cedar Hollow that year, and with it came the test. The trouble began with Tom Ackerley, who owned the largest spread in the valley, and had never in his life paid a bill on time. He came to the forge in a black temper over a set of wagon repairs, and the price Eli set on them. And when Eli would not bend, Ackerley reached for the only weapon a man like that ever carries. "Should have known better than to deal square with you," Ackerley said loud so the men loitering by the mercantile could hear. "Marked like that. My grandmother always said a fire scars the devil's own brands the wickedness right up to the surface where decent folks can see it." He looked toward Margaret, who had come out at the sound of raised voices. "And you Boston must be hard up sending its women to wed a thing like him. What did he pay for you?" The street went very quiet. Margaret had spent 34 years learning when to hold her tongue. This was not one of those times. She crossed the frozen street and stood square in front of Tom Airlie, and she did not raise her voice because she did not need to. "My husband," she said, "was pulled from a burning barn because he went back into it for somebody else's animals when wiser men stood clear. That's how he came by his face, Mr. Ackerley. He carries the proof of his own courage on his skin every single day where the rest of us get to hide ours. So when you look at him, what you're seeing is the mark of a man who runs toward the fire while you run from your bills." She let that settle. "Now he's done your wagon honest. Pay him honest or take your trade somewhere there isn't one. But there isn't another forge in 40 miles, and you and I both know it." Somewhere behind her, one of the men by the mercantile laughed, but it was a different kind of laugh this time, and it was not aimed at Eli. Tom Ackerley paid. He paid in full, and he did not say another word, and he climbed onto his repaired wagon and drove out of Cedar Hollow with his ears burning redder than any forge. That night, Eli Brennan sat at his own table and could not meet his wife's eyes. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I'd borne worse than Tom Ackerley. I'm used to it." "That's exactly why I had to do it," Margaret said. "Because you're used to it, and you shouldn't have to be." She reached across the table and laid her hand over his great scarred one. "I didn't come west to be tolerated, Eli. And I won't have you tolerated either. Not in your own town, not in front of me." He turned his hand over slowly and closed it around hers. It was the first time he had reached for her of his own accord. What he could not have known was that the valley had been watching that street the way it had watched the stagecoach in the autumn, and that this time the story it carried home was a different one entirely. Spring came late, but it came the way it always does, and Cedar Hollow thawed in more ways than one. It happened slowly, the way real change always does. The market women, who had paused to watch the Boston bride, humiliated, now stopped at her door with cutings for her garden and recipes for the long winters. The men who had laughed outside the saloon began one by one to nod to Eli on the street and call him by his name. Sadie Mercer all but lived at the forge now with her mother's blessing, and Eli had made her a whole tin herd of little iron animals that she lined up on the windowsill of the boarding house like a parade. And one evening in May, with the lilacs heavy on the air, and the light gone long and golden across the valley, Margaret found her husband standing in the doorway of the forge, looking out at the mountains. "I have to tell you something," he said, "and I've been trying to say it for a week and making a poor job of it." He turned to face her, and for once, he did not turn the scarred side away. "When I wrote that notice, I expected nobody. I'd made my peace with it. A man learns to want less, so the wanting doesn't kill him." His voice went rough. "And then you got down off that stage and looked me dead in the face and put out your hand. And I've spent every day since wondering when you'll come to your senses and wish you'd stayed in Boston." Margaret crossed to him. She reached up and laid her palm flat against the burned side of his face, the side no one touched, the side he had spent 11 years hiding, and she held it there warm and steady until she felt the breath go out of him. "Eli Brennan," she said, "I have never once wished I'd stayed in Boston. Not on the worst day. Not for 1 minute." Her eyes were bright. "They told me a story about you before I ever came. The same one they told the whole town, that no woman would have you. And every word of it was wrong. The only thing wrong with you is that you believe them." She smiled. "I didn't come here to settle husband. I came here to be loved by a brave and honest man, and I have been every single day. Whether either of us had the courage to say so out loud." He bent his head and pressed his ruined cheek against the top of her hair, and his shoulders shook once, and then he simply held her there in the doorway of the forge, with the lilacs and the long gold light, and the whole valley going quiet around them. They had 11 years between them of being told they were too marked, too poor, too plain, too late to be loved. They spent the rest of their lives proving it a lie. In the years that came after, Cedar Hollow forgot it had ever laughed. There were people who would swear later that they had always known the blacksmith was a good man, that they'd never once held his face against him, that they'd welcomed the Boston bride from the very first day. Margaret let them say it. She had learned long ago that grace is mostly the art of letting people become better than they were without making them apologize for who they'd been. Sadie Mercer grew up and married a rancher's son. And at her wedding, she wore pinned beneath her collar where no one could see, the very first little iron horse the scarred blacksmith had ever bent for a frightened child at his fence. She named her own son Eli. She never told anyone why, and she never had to. And on summer evenings, for as long as anyone could remember, you could find the blacksmith of Cedar Hollow and his wife, sitting together on the porch of their small plain house up the rise, his great scarred hand wrapped around her smaller one, watching the light go long and gold across the valley that had been so sure, so very sure that no woman would ever wed him. They had been right about exactly one thing. No ordinary woman would have. But Margaret Sullivan had never once in her life been ordinary, and Eli Brennan had known it the moment she put out her